Hello, everybody. Today I will be discussing an ethical dilemma involving a nonprofit organization that provides housing assistance and case management services to low income families. In this scenario, the organization has received a major grant from private foundation to expand its services. However, the grant comes with a condition that services must be prioritized for families with children and at least one employed adult. Although this requirement may provide the organization with important financial resources, it creates an ethical conflict because it excludes individuals and families who are unemployed, do not have children, or are experiencing chronic homelessness. As a program administrator, I would be responsible for implementing the grant requirements while also maintaining my professional responsibilities as a social worker. My goal would be to identify a solution that allows the agency to maintain its funding while minimizing harm to clients who may be excluded in the grant's requirements. The primary ethical dilemma is a conflict between accepting funding that could help the organization serve more people and ensuring that services are distributed fairly and equitably. On one side, accepting the grant could provide additional resources, allowing the agency to expand housing assistance and benefit many families who meet the grant requirements. If the organization refuses the funding, it could potentially lose an important resource of financial support and may have fewer resources available to serve clients overall. On the other hand, implementing the grant's requirements without questions could discriminate against vulnerable populations. Individuals who are unemployed may be unable to work because of disability, lack of transportation, discrimination, limited education, or other systematic barriers. Individuals without children may also experience significant housing instability and homelessness and still have legitimate needs for assistance. This creates a conflict between organizational sustainability and the social work values of social justice, dignity, and worth of the persons and equitable access to services. Several populations can be affected by this policy. Single adults experience homelessness could be excluded simply because they do not have children. Families without an employed adult could also be denied or placed at a lower priority even when they have significant housing needs. People experiencing disabilities may be particularly vulnerable because their inability to maintain employment may be connected to their disabilities. Individuals experiencing discrimination in employment, survivors of domestic violence, people with limited access to transportation, and individuals experiencing long-term unemployment could also be negatively affected. Chronically homeless individuals are another important population to consider. These individuals often have complex needs and may require significant support to obtain stable housing. Excluding them from services because they do not meet employment or family requirements could increase existing disparities and make it more difficult for them to achieve stability. Several sections of the NASW Code of Ethics are relevant to this situation. First, Standard 1.01, Commitment to Clients, states that social workers' primary responsibility is to promote the well-being of clients, while social workers must consider the needs of society as a whole. The interests of clients remain an important professional responsibility. Standard 1.02, self-determination, is also relevant because social workers should respect and promote clients' rights to make their own decision. Although this particular dilemma focuses more directly on access to services, respecting clients means recognizing their individual circumstances rather than making assumptions about their worth based on employment and family status. Standard 1.05, cultural competency, is important because social workers must recognize and respect diversity. Different clients may experience barriers to employment and housing based on culture, disability, social economic circumstances, or other factors. Most importantly, Standard 6.04, social and political actions, emphasizes the responsibility of social workers to promote social justice and challenge policies and practices that create or reinforce inequality. As a program administrator, I would have the ethical responsibility to advocate for vulnerable clients while also working within the realities of the organization. To address this dilemma, I would use RIM's ethical decision-making model. This model provides a structured process for identifying ethical issues, examining relevant principles, considering possible consequences, and determining the appropriate cause of action. The first step would be to identify the ethical issues and conflicting obligations. In this case, the conflict is between the requirements of the funding organization, the financial needs of the nonprofit, and the social worker's responsibility to promote client well-being and social justice. Next, I would identify the individual's group affected by the decision. This would include eligible families, exclude individuals, agency employees, organizational leadership, current clients, potential clients, and a larger community. I would examine relevant ethical standards, laws, regulations, agency policies, and grant requirements. I would carefully determine whether the grant requirement actually requires the agency to completely exclude unemployed individuals and the people without children, or whether it simply requires the agency to prioritize certain populations. This distinction could create opportunities for the agency to serve other populations through alternative funding sources. The next step would be to identify possible course of actions and examine the consequences of each. One option would be to fully implement the grant requirement without modification. Another would be to refuse the funding. And third, and potentially more ethical option, would be to accept the grant while developing additional strategies to continue serving clients who do not meet the grant's requirements. As a social worker and program administrator, I would have the responsibility to advocate for clients while also recognizing my responsibility to the organization. I would simply ignore the grant's requirements because doing so, I would not simply ignore the grant's requirements because doing so could jeopardize the organization's funding and potentially affect many clients. However, I also would not remain silent if the policies created significant harm or discrimination. My responsibility would be to raise the concerns with organizational leadership, document the ethical issues, and advocate for alternatives. I would approach management with advice with evidence showing how the policies could affect vulnerable population and propose solutions that preserve the grants while reducing harm. I would also consult with colleagues, supervisors, legal or complacent staff, and other appropriate professionals. Consultation would help ensure that my decision is not based solely on my personal belief, but is grounded in professional ethics, organizational responsibilities, and applicable requirements. If the agency implements the policy without any additional safeguard, many vulnerable clients could experience negative consequences. They may lose access to housing assistance, remain homeless longer, or experience worsening physical and mental health, financial instability, and family stress. This could be long-term consequences for the agency. Clients and community partners may begin to view the organization as prioritizing funding over its mission to serve vulnerable populations. This could damage organizational trust and reputation. However, refusing the grant could also create serious problems. The organization may lose the opportunity to expand services and staff positions, or existing programs could potentially be affected by the loss of funding. Therefore, the decision should focus on finding balance that protects the agency's sustainability without abandoning the population that are most vulnerable. So my first plan of action would be to review the exact grant language and determine the flexibility available within the funding requirements. I will meet the agency's leadership and explain the ethical concerns associated with excluding undocumented individuals and people without children. I would also recommend developing a transparent referral system so clients who do not qualify for grant-funded services are not simply turned away. Instead, they can be connected with other housing programs, employment services, disability resources, emergency assistance, or community organization. So the strategy to minimum harm, there's several strategies that would help. The first being the agency would communicate eligibility requirements so clients understand why certain services may not be available to them. Secondly, staff should avoid blaming clients for unemployment or homelessness. Unemployment status should not be treated as an indicator of a person's worth or motivation. The agency should maintain a list of alternative resources and referral partnerships for individuals who are not eligible for the grant-funded program. And lastly, social workers should continue advocating at the organizational and policy level for funding practices that recognize the complexity of homelessness and poverty. This dilemma demonstrates how social workers can experience ethical conflicts at a macro level. Social work is not only about direct practices with individuals. Social workers also have responsibilities to examine policies, organizational practices, and systems that influence people's access to resources. Situations like this can lead to mission drafts, and this occurs when an organization gradually changes its priorities to meet funding requirements rather than remaining focused on its original mission and needs for the community. And if a Organization is repeatedly prioritizing the population that are easiest to fund or service. It may eventually move away from servicing people with the greatest needs. Clients need to believe that social service organizations are advocating for them and treating them with dignity. When clients feel that services are based primarily on financial consideration, trust is damaged. In conclusion, this ethical dilemma requires balancing organizational sustainability with the social work profession's commitment to clients' well being, social justice, and equitable access to service. Using Raymer's ethical decision making model would allow me to systematically identify the ethical issues, consider the stakeholders, review professional standards and organizational requirements, examine possible consequences, and develop an appropriate plan. I would recommend accepting the funding if possible while advocating for flexibility, developing alternative funding sources, creating referral options, and continuing to advocate for clients who are excluded by this grant. Social workers have an important role in challenging policies that may create barriers for vulnerable population. Ethical leadership requires more than simply following organizational policies. It requires social workers to consider how decisions affect clients, protect professional values, and advocate for systems that promote dignity, equality, and social justice.